There's a moment, and if you've read Managers Are Terminated After 30 Days, you know exactly which kind of moment I mean, where Yeon Sihun is in trouble. Not theoretical trouble, real, visible, immediate trouble, and someone reaches toward him, offers something, a hand, a word, a way out, and he doesn't take it. He doesn't hesitate dramatically. He doesn't grimace and look away. He just doesn't take it, as if the offer didn't register, as if the reaching hand is simply part of the background noise of a world that doesn't particularly concern him. Most people read that as pride, the lone wolf doing what lone wolves do, the overpowered protagonist who doesn't need the side characters cluttering up his battlefield. It's not pride. What you're watching is a nervous system that has learned, at a very deep, very old level, that needing someone is more dangerous than whatever threat is currently in front of him. The silence isn't arrogance, it's a scar that learned to walk. Section 1. The surface read versus the real read. The casual read of Yeon Sihun is familiar. You've seen this archetype before, and so has the algorithm. Stoic, exceptionally capable, socially minimal, the kind of manhwa protagonist who arrives first, leaves last, and never tells you what he's thinking. His power curve is steep, and his emotional range at first glance appears to be somewhere between controlled and absent. This is the surface read. And it isn't wrong exactly. It's just describing the wall instead of what's behind it. Because there's a category error that happens constantly with characters like Yeon Sihun. Readers, and sometimes the manhwa itself, mistake the architecture of his psychology for his personality. They see the isolation and call it introversion. They see the refusal and call it confidence. They see a man who doesn't ask for help and assume he's decided he doesn't need any. But isolation as personality and isolation as psychological structure are not the same thing. One is a preference. The other is a response to a history. One is chosen. The other is built, brick by brick over years, often beginning before the person was old enough to understand what they were building or why. Yeon Sihun's self-containment is not a character trait that emerged from nowhere. It is a system. And systems, unlike personalities, have an original function. They were built to do something. They were built in response to something. The question worth asking, the one this channel always asks, is not what he does, but when did doing it become the only option he could see? Section 2. The psychology of refusing help. Let's talk about shame. Not guilt, shame. The distinction matters enormously here. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am wrong. My need itself is the problem. Shame operates at the level of identity, not behavior. And what shame does to a nervous system is specific and brutal. It activates hypervigilance, a constant low-level scan of the environment for threat, specifically social threat. Who is watching? Who knows? What can be used against me? The body stays in a state of readiness that has nothing to do with external danger and everything to do with the terror of being seen as insufficient. In Yeon Sihun, you can watch this operating in real time if you know what you're looking for. He is always slightly ahead of every social situation, always managing the frame before anyone else can define it. He doesn't wait to be found lacking. He removes himself from the context in which lacking could be assessed. He doesn't ask, so no one can say no. He doesn't reach, so no one can pull away. He doesn't depend, so dependence cannot become a weapon. This is what psychologists sometimes call strategic humiliation resistance, though the clinical language makes it sound more calculated than it feels from the inside. It doesn't feel like strategy. It feels like survival. When someone has been humiliated enough, when their need has been met with rejection, contempt, or weaponization often enough, the nervous system stops processing, I could ask for help, as an option. Not because the person has decided asking is weak, because the body has already run the risk calculation and returned a verdict. The cost is too high. Attachment theory gives us another lens here. Secure attachment, the developmental foundation that lets adults reach toward others without the reaching feeling like exposure, is built through repeated early experiences of need being met safely. Reach out, someone responds. Ask, someone answers. The world is provisionally trustworthy. Insecure avoidant attachment develops when the opposite becomes true. When reaching is met with silence, withdrawal, or punishment often enough, the developing person, child, adolescent, doesn't matter, learns to deactivate the attachment system entirely. Not to suppress it dramatically, not to rage against it, simply to turn it down. Make it quiet, make the need itself smaller until needing feels like something other people do. Yeon Sihun doesn't read as someone who was taught that asking for help is weak. He reads as someone who was taught, experientially and repeatedly, that asking for help produces an outcome worse than not asking. That is a different lesson. It leaves a different mark. And then there is dissociation, the subtlest piece and the most important. Dissociation in this context doesn't mean breakdown or unreality. It means the gradual, adaptive uncoupling of emotion from awareness. You stop noticing you're tired. You stop feeling the pull of loneliness. You stop registering the weight of what you're carrying because registering it would mean acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would mean the whole architecture of self-sufficiency begins to crack. Yeon Sihun is not unfeeling. He is unfelt. There is a difference, and the Manhwa at its best moments knows it. Section 3. What the silence is protecting. So, what is underneath it? What is the wound that all this architecture was built to protect? This is where the backstory stops being backstory and starts being the actual story. What Yeon Sihun's history, pieced together through what the Manhwa shows and, crucially, what it refuses to show, suggests is not a single catastrophic event. It's something harder to point to and easier to dismiss. The accumulation of small, consistent lessons about what happens to men, specifically young men, specifically men in hierarchical systems, when they show their underside. Korean cultural frameworks around masculinity are not incidental here, they're structural. In a social context organized around hierarchy, collective face, and the profound shame of visible inadequacy, the cost of visible need is not just personal, it's social, it's relational, it can be permanent. The man who is seen needing too much, depending too openly, struggling too visibly, he doesn't just feel embarrassed, he changes position. He loses something that cannot necessarily be regained. Yeon Sihun didn't learn that asking for help was weak from a single teacher or a single moment. He learned it from the accumulated logic of the world he moved through. Every time strength was rewarded and vulnerability was exploited. Every time someone who reached out got used, got left, got made smaller for the reaching. And here is the thing about that. Here is what gets missed in every surface-level reading of characters like him. His silence is not coldness. His silence is grief. He is mourning. He is mourning a version of himself, earlier before the architecture fully set, who was allowed to need people, who had not yet learned that dependence was a liability, who could reach without calculating the angle of the fall. That version of him didn't survive whatever environment shaped him. Or rather, he survived, and that version didn't. The system that replaced it was effective. It worked. It got him through. But something was lost in the construction of it, and at some level, below the hypervigilance, below the strategic positioning, below the quiet competence, he knows it. The silence is protecting that knowledge, because to admit the grief would be to admit the loss, and to admit the loss would be to admit that it mattered, that he needed what he didn't get, that the asking, once, was real. Section 4. The cost of the armor works. That is the tragedy of it. It genuinely, functionally works until it doesn't, and by then it's fused to the skin. Look at what Yeon Sihun's self-protective structure costs him, concretely and in the text. It costs him his relationships. Not because he is unlovable, that framing is too simple and too convenient, but because genuine relationship requires a kind of mutual exposure that his system is specifically designed to prevent. You can be near Yeon Sihun. You can fight beside him, rely on him, be protected by him. What you cannot do is reach him. The door is architecturally absent. It was removed from the blueprints a long time ago. It costs him the ability to receive care without sabotaging it. This is the subtler loss, and the more painful one to watch. When care arrives, when someone insists, when something breaks through the perimeter, his first response is not relief. His first response is threat assessment. Why are they doing this? What do they want? What will this cost me? The care gets filtered through the same hyper-vigilant system that was built to deflect attack, and it comes out the other side looking like a trap, so he deflects it. Not cruelly, not dramatically, just efficiently. A redirection here, a slight withdrawal there. The care dissipates before it can take root, and the person offering it is left with the specific, confusing loneliness of having reached towards someone who seemed to simply not notice. But the deepest cost is the dissociation, because the system, as it matures, begins to eat the thing it was protecting. He stops being able to feel what he needs, even when the need is real and the help is genuinely available. The circuitry that would register I'm struggling, that would allow the ordinary human experience of being overwhelmed and admitting it, has been rerouted for so long that the signal barely reaches consciousness. He doesn't refuse help because he is arrogant. He refuses help because he genuinely cannot tell anymore that he needs it. The armor has become the body. And here is the paradox that Manhwa, like this one, keeps circling without always naming directly. The very system that kept him alive, that got him through whatever needed to be survived, is now the primary obstacle to him actually living. The protection is the damage. The strength is the wound. He built something extraordinary to survive, and now he lives inside it. And the walls are very high, and there are no windows, and he cannot quite remember what light felt like before he learned to do without it. Section 5. The narrative question. So does the Manhwa crack this open? This is where I want to be honest rather than generous, because these are not the same thing. There are moments. There are moments where something gets close, where a character pushes past the perimeter far enough that Yeon Sihun's system cannot quite reroute it in time, and something shows on his face, or in the space between his words, that is older than his competence and more real than his control. These moments are the most carefully written in the text. They are brief. They are precise. The Manhwa knows better than to linger on them because Yeon Sihun himself would not linger. But does anything fundamentally break the pattern? Does he ask, truly ask, in a way that costs him something? Does he receive care without the quiet, efficient sabotage? Incompletely. And I think that incompleteness is intentional. There's an argument, and I find it more interesting than the redemption arc reading, that the author is not writing toward resolution. That what is being documented here is not a wound being healed, but a wound being seen. And those are very different things. A wound being healed needs a narrative climax, a turning point, a before and after. A wound being seen just needs honest attention. The camera holds still. It doesn't look away. It doesn't rescue the character from his own psychology. What that absence says, if you read it as a statement rather than a failure, some men never get the moment that breaks the pattern. Some men are raised to survive alone, and they do. And the surviving is so complete and so costly that by the time anyone gets close enough to offer something different, the man himself is no longer sure he is capable of receiving it. The narrative is not pessimistic, it's precise. It's describing something real about what this kind of formation does, and it is not willing to lie about the difficulty of its undoing. Yeon Sihun is not an anomaly in Manhwa. He is a pattern. The hypercompetent, emotionally sealed protagonist who makes everyone around him safer and more capable and who cannot be reached. He appears everywhere in this genre. Sung Jin-woo, Kim Duk-ja, the architects of their own isolation, men who became extraordinary through the very process of needing nothing, and who carry the bill for that becoming in every interaction that gets close and then quietly goes nowhere. What Manhwa keeps returning to, what I think it is actually trying to work through at the level of culture, is a question about the men that Korean society produces when it optimizes for performance and survival and control, when strength is so relentlessly rewarded that its price becomes invisible, when the man who never asks for help is held up as the ideal, and no one thinks to ask what it cost him to stop asking. Yeon Sihun's silence is not a character quirk. It is the logical endpoint of a very coherent set of lessons about what kind of man is worth being. He learned those lessons. He passed. He became exactly what the environment shaped him to be. And somewhere, beneath the armor, beneath the hypervigilance, beneath the extraordinary self-sufficient competence, there is still the person who needed something once, who reached, who learned very precisely not to. The question the Manhwa is quietly asking, the one it never quite answers because it is too honest to pretend the answer is easy, is whether anyone gets to that person in time, or whether the armor always wins. Not because the man behind it isn't worth reaching, but because he's had so long to make sure no one can find the door.